So I've finished working on these models for now, and basically the main difference really between these and the original one is this is the one we just cut from the bandsaw. So as you can see here, it's quite rough. All of this here is very pink, it's like a dark pink. You see lots of pitted parts in it. That's the natural cut of the foam. But once you've sanded it, this is a fairly good example. Once it's sanded down, it goes a much lighter colour than the other one. It kind of takes it all right back down to a natural surface. So in order to do that, what I would have done is I used about 80 gradient, which was very tough. This is like an 80 gradient here, quite a rough paper. Just to get the worst of it off, then it would have gone to like a 120. And then what you want to end up doing is using a 1200. So if you use something like, let's have a look, yeah, like a 1200 gradient. This is very fine. If you're using that, basically it will bring up a very smooth finish to your model, and that's what you want. And you want to have the whole thing really smooth before your paint goes on. And as you can see here, if you use a 1200 gradient, you get very tight, sharp edges around the model, and that's what you want. So you can get nice crisp edges like this, or you can round them off. Depends on what you want really. So yeah, a lot of this was done really, we're just making major cuts. You can see in here where I've used card body filler, and I've filled in these parts in here. This was like a triangular cut from the bandsaw. I've used card body filler in there and filled that in, and I got these shapes in here and in here. This round was created simply by wrapping the paper, as I did before, around other things like that, and then using that to work into these shapes like this, yeah, to create the shapes you want. You should never really be using your hands just to create the shape, unless it's something very organic that you want here. You should always be using something else, either flat-sided to create flat edges. I've been using a hard bit of plastic that's been quite large, wrap paper around to get these surfaces here. You never really want to be using your hands unless you're trying to get something very fluid. You just get a much better finish. If the edges are good and the sides are flat, your model will look nice. So I'm going to leave this one. We're not going to use this one because it's I don't have time. This one I'm going to leave pink because you can see the card body filler in it. Like here, if you make a mistake in the filler when you're making the model, when you cut a piece out that you don't want, you can always use filler to fill it back in again. The nice thing is the card body filler is the same density as the foam, so they both sort of sand at the same rate, which means you don't get any blending line between the two. It's not like a hard glue, for example, that would be quite tough. You get a blend line, you don't with this, so that's quite good. So yeah, finish is most important, and you need to get a very good finish on your models ready for when you spray, because your models will look much better. This is not like the blue foam. The blue foam, you can't get to this finish unless you're covering it in plaster of Paris and then sanding it down, and even then it's not particularly good. So you can get an instant good finish with the foam as it is, and then obviously when you get your paint on top, you can finish that better, so when your top coat goes down, it just looks, well, as good as perfect really. So this one we're going to leave. This one we're going to spray in primer to give an example of a couple of coats of primer, what that would look like when that's done. And this one here, I've decided to turn this into a little radio. I never actually started out planning it to be a radio, but I went and had a play around in Poundland yesterday and found loads of little bits. I started to sound like an advocate for Poundland. I'm not. It's just that you can get loads of things for nothing. So for example, there was an aerial there yesterday for £1, little TV aerial, so I've got that and I'm going to stick that in there. You see what I mean, like this, and that'll become a little aerial like this on the radio, right? And they had garden lamps, so I bought that and took the solar panel out of it, and I'm going to stick that in here. I took apart an old MP3 player. I thought it was quite nice. Well, it was until I took it to bits. And there's going to be a button that I'm going to fix in there. There's some LEDs. I got these from Poundland on something else. I'm going to have some LEDs in there like that. I've got a what you would call it, headphone socket, no, a 5mm jack. I'm going to fit that in there. Have headphone coming out of it. I've got some bottle tops. I might not use these yet. I don't know. Depends how much time I've got. Right, but they've got a nice edge to them, right? So they can be, that can be the volume. I've got a couple of screens. I'm going to stick one of them in here with the screen behind it, and there's an on and off button which I'm going to have in here. So I'm basically just going to make a little radio out of it when it's sprayed up. And I've got some Letraset. Now Letraset make pens, but they also used to make transfers. If you go on eBay you can find them. You basically rub them on to the model and the letters come off, so I can put Sony down the side or whatever I want to make it look real. Yeah, that's it. So look, this just took me about a day really. I spent about 6 hours working on this today, and I probably spent about 3 hours or 4 hours working on it yesterday. So it's a full 10-hour day of work to get to this stage. So yeah, it is quite full on when you're making things, but that's why we need to make a start now and move forward with it. What else do you need to know? Yeah, for making this part in here I used a Dremel type and milled that out in here. Now admittedly that was extremely difficult to do with just my hands. I don't have a clamp or anything, but essentially with things like this you'd mill them out. But for getting nice round shapes like in there, I would have wrapped some sandpaper again like around a bottle top and put a bit of tape around it and just use that to get that shape inside. And for these edges in here, you might be able to see it in the light. Wrap that bit of 1200 paper around a bit of plastic and just use that to create a nice edge like this, right? Just make it nice and flat. Just take a bit of time. I've rushed this really, to be honest with you, so it's not as good as it could be if I spent a week on it. And then I've got a couple of screws which I'm going to drop in as well, just to sort of give it some authenticity. There's a couple of holes. I've nicked some rubber feet off a hard disk I've got at home. I'm going to stick them in there. And that's it. Yeah, I'll spray that up. I'll put some proper paint on it and it will probably look like something fairly realistic to a degree from a distance. But that's it. So yeah, real paint, and we'll move on to the primer. We'll give that a bash.